then again on December 3rd as they work to install some of the mounting brackets, and then I've already completely installed one of the iROSA solar arrays that flew up to continue this augmentation work. Meanwhile, down here on the ground in Mission Control Houston, we'll have a couple of key players that you will see and hear today. Leading the Orbit 2 team that just came on console is NASA Flight Director Fiona Turret. And then Chris Mundy is going to be the lead spacewalk officer for today. He'll be in the back row of the room. And then NASA astronaut Nick Hague, you can see there right in the center in that gray suit. He's going to be our spacewalk support captain, also known as our ground IV. So we're going to hear him talking directly to Frank and Josh as they're working outside. Now, the goal of today is to install a new iROSA, one of those roll-out solar arrays, and this is part of an ongoing plan that's been stretched over the last couple of years that we're starting to get to the final stages of. So in this graphic you can see 3B, 1A, 2A, 4B. Each one of those number and letter combinations correspond to a power channel. We have 8 power channels supported by the pairs of solar arrays on board the International Space Station. Everything in blue, we've already installed an array. And so you can see on the right side those smaller arrays that are kind of canted up at an angle over 4B and 2B. That shows you how these look once they're installed and completely unfurled. They cover a small amount of the existing, the legacy arrays, but once everything is installed, once all 6 iROSAs have been completely installed, we're going to be increasing the power capability, the power generation capability on board the space station by about 30%. And these are brand new arrays, so they'll be able to last throughout the remainder of the lifetime of the International Space Station, as we're looking at continuing to have this orbiting laboratory until at least 2030. So we're going to be increasing the station's power generator to about 250 kilowatts total, an increase of about 30%. Now today we are going to be working on 4A, so that in that bottom right side you can see 4A. The mounting hardware has already been installed, and today we're going to be bringing out one of these iROSAs to install them. Now this is what the iROSA looks like after it's unfolded but not completely unfurled. So each of these rides up in the trunk of a SpaceX Dragon spacecraft, and after they are able to carry them out there, so in the top left, that's what they look like right now. They're folded up. And then once they get them out to the work site, that top right is what it looks like. Is they're going to manually unfold them. We'll have both Josh and Frank out at the work site. One of them is going to be Josh Cassada, in today's spacewalk is going to be riding the robotic arm to carry those arrays from their temporary stow location out to the work site to install on 4 Alpha, 4A, and then they'll work to unfold them. And then there's a number of bolts and then different cable interfaces. So that mandrel hinge, that assembly bolt, that's going to be hand tightened, and that's what's going to essentially lock them in place after it's been unfolded. The NZGL stands for the NASA Zero Gravity Lever. That's just a reference to the cable type that we're going to be using, but those cable interfaces are what we're going to be attaching to integrate the new iROSA array with the existing array on the 4A power channel, and plugging both of those in, essentially a wide junction. So you'll have one going to the power source from the existing array, one to the new array that plugs into 4A, and then both are providing power to the channel. And then those blanket tensioner bolts, those will be 2 of the last things that they're responsible for releasing. Once those are released, it engages a mechanism that pulls down on some wire, essentially to provide some tension. As after these are unfurled, just like the existing arrays, they're going to be moved over time. These arrays can automatically track the sun, make sure we're harvesting as much energy as possible for the station systems, and so having that extra rigidity will help out.
And we'll break the debrief at 12:06.
Copy, 12:06.
And just continuing real quick through the rest. So once these iROSAs are bolted in place, they're going to be deployed They'll release a special bracket, and then 2 booms on either side will unfurl the arrays in the middle. If you look at those pictures on the right, the white section are the booms. Now we'll see those unfurl. The best way I've heard them described so far came from our lead spacewalk officer for today. They essentially work like if you took a straw, split it right down the middle, and rolled it up. If you unfurled it, it naturally tries to retain a circular shape, essentially go back to being a straw. That's more or less the concept behind these booms. They also have these magnets that will lock in place as it unfurls, and those will be one of the primary visual aids for the spacewalkers, who are just going to be giving these constant updates as it unfurls to help lock it in place. In total, they're pretty large. They weigh just around 750 pounds each. Here's all the dimensions. So pretty sizable. It's good to remember that while weight isn't necessarily a concern as we're operating in microgravity, these things still have mass. So once they start moving, it can be pretty hard to stop them moving. So a lot of very slow, a lot of very deliberate movements as we're moving these from their work site all the way out to 4A to get installed. Now, if we jump back inside the airlock, we've heard a couple of updates from the team. So they're just wrapping up what's known as their pre-breathe inside the airlock. And right as we came in the air, we heard them talking about MEDOX canister changeout. Now, MEDOX stands for metal oxide.
We're in step 17 and reporting all the MEDOX canisters. Serial numbers are 18 and 12.
Copy, Coach. Those are good numbers.
And just there, Koichi Wakata giving another update on MEDOX canisters. MEDOX canisters are part of the life support system inside these spacesuits. It's commonly referred to that these spacesuits are essentially mini spacecraft themselves. They have an entire life support system inside, heating, cooling, and then MEDOX is part of essentially the atmosphere revitalization system inside. So just like as we're on the space station, as you breathe out, you inhale oxygen, you exhale carbon dioxide, and you need a way to actively get rid of that carbon dioxide. Otherwise, it can just stay in your suit, and as CO2 builds up, that can start to cause issues for us as humans. And MEDOX is the means at which we're capturing that carbon essentially inside these spacesuits. It uses a metal oxide, and in this case, a silver oxide, that goes through a chemical process when it's in contact with moisture, and then carbon dioxide forms a precipitate. So it can essentially go through this chemical reaction to constantly capture this carbon dioxide as they're exhaling it inside of those spacesuits. And they're a little bit different from the systems that we use on board the space station, which are essentially running around the clock and have more of a active regenerative process.
One GMT at 12:10, and for Josh TCB, it's now at 4:04.
Copy all.
And we're continuing to get some good call outs that we're getting closer to having the crew move into the crew lock section. They're in equipment lock right now, but they'll be moving over to the crew lock section shortly. That's where we'll close the hatch and use a series of pumps and valves to bring that down to vacuum. One final note, so that MEDOX that's able to capture that carbon, that's the MEDOX canisters, like all of the life support, are located in that backpack section on the spacesuits that you see the astronauts wearing. It actively captures that carbon dioxide over time. Eventually it will get saturated though, so that's why it's considered a consumable. You'll often hear the term limiting consumable used whenever we're going through a spacewalk, and you essentially have three that you're really looking at. We're tracking how much oxygen, how much O2 is inside the spacesuit, how much carbon dioxide capture we have remaining. That's your MEDOX. And then power, as these suits, once they're completely unplugged, are running on batteries. You also have a limited amount of water that's used inside for all of the cooling and a couple of other fluid systems inside. So that MEDOX is typically the limiting consumable, and that just means if we looked at which one we're going to run out of first, that's your limiting consumable. And so we'll keep a close eye, and you'll typically hear throughout the spacewalk a target duration, or we're looking at 7 hours with MEDOX limiting. You'll hear those call outs up to the crew as they're just giving them a gradual status. So that's what, when you hear MEDOX, that's what it's referring to. Meanwhile, the crew is just finishing up their pre-breathe. So it takes a couple of hours just to get ready for a spacewalk. So before they even get into these suits, we have to go through a couple of steps just to make sure that we're keeping them safe as they're moving into essentially a depressurized environment. So on board the space station, just like if you're walking around here at sea level, the atmospheric pressure inside is about 14.7 psi. And when they're outside in the vacuum of space, though, those spacesuits are pressurized, but not to 14.7 psi. If we were to pressurize a spacesuit that much, it'd be almost impossible to move. It'd be like fighting against a really stiff balloon, essentially. It'd be really hard to manipulate fingers, move arms, things like that. And so what we're able to do is have them operate in a lower pressure setting. Those spacesuits go to about 4.3 psi once we see them out in the vacuum of space. So 4.3, that's a lot easier to move around. It's still pretty intensive to use your hands in that spacesuit, as you are just constantly fighting against that pressure. But as they're at a lower pressure, they're also breathing a 100% oxygen atmosphere, essentially, when they're in those suits. That way, you can operate at a lower pressure, but you're still getting the oxygen that you need. And we operate on a lot of the same restrictions as anybody who's ever gone scuba diving. As you go deeper and deeper into the water, you're in a higher and higher pressure environment, and then as you come back to the surface, you need to take your time as you do it, or you can suffer what's known as decompression sickness. And all that really will be different gases. The primary one we look for is nitrogen. When it's in your blood and in tissues in your body, it's at kind of an ambient pressure, or it's at an equal pressure with your ambient surroundings. But if you start to depressurize quickly, the pressure in those gases in your veins, in your tissues, will be higher than the pressure around it, and that can form bubbles. And if those bubbles start to form, they can cause problems. One of the most common ones is, as it's starting to happen, is you'll start to get joint pain, things like that, but it can eventually cause some pretty serious issues with your nervous system, and so that's why we have to be very careful, very deliberate, and to prepare them for that lower pressure environment, we do what's called a pre-breathe. A long time ago, we used to have the astronauts actually camp out, sleep in the airlock overnight at a lower pressure, around 10 psi, breathing an increased oxygen atmosphere, and that would help just kind of gradually purge that excess nitrogen from the blood. But as the teams have gotten more and more experience, they were able to develop a new process called in-suit light exercise. And in this case, the crew, as their morning begins, they go inside the airlock and they are at that reduced pressure of about 10 psi, and they're breathing pure oxygen that starts to help essentially reject that nitrogen out of the system, but you're doing it in a very gradual fashion. And then after they've done that for a few hours, they get suited up inside of these spacesuits, and then they start doing what's known as in-suit light exercise. So they're past it at this point, so we won't see it, but they essentially sit there attached to the wall still, moving arms, moving legs, and they do it at kind of timed intervals. And this is just to, again, consistently reject that nitrogen, get that out of the system as we get ready to have them operate in that pure oxygen environment. And so that's all done. We're now in the steps getting ready for depress. The team here in Mission Control is actually about to do a go, no-go for depress. Now, depress just referring to depressurization. That's us taking them into the crew lock section, closing the hatch, and then removing all of the atmosphere in there and bringing it down to a vacuum. So again, a vacuum is just an absence of stuff. In this case, an absence of atmosphere. And we need to get the crew lock section down as close to vacuum as possible before they open up the hatch and move out into the vacuum of space. So the team here in Mission Control is going to do a go, no-go right now as we get closer to this go for depress. And so before we get there, though, we see Koichi Wakata continuing to work. He's on Frank Rubio's spacesuit right now. You saw them attach something to the bottom of that backpack, that life support system, and that is the SAFER device, Simplified Aid for EVA Rescue, and essentially functions as a small jetpack. It's not anything we use for actual maneuvering when we're outside on station, but it is just another step in the line of defense of keeping an astronaut attached to the station. They'll use a series of tethers. A lot of the communication you're going to hear throughout the spacewalk today is them assessing where their tethers are located. They practice all of these where they're going to put tethers for the different handrails, but essentially that keeps them attached physically to the station at all times throughout a spacewalk. Should they become untethered, they can use that SAFER device to then fly back to the space station. So that's just an extra layer of safety for these spacewalking astronauts.
For the EV1 for Frank, TCV is at position 4.
Houston copies.
But Koichi Wakata and Nicole Mann working right now to get the SAFER onto Frank Rubio, who again, he's going to be EV1, our lead spacewalker for today. One of the primary jobs of the lead spacewalker is going to be doing all the hatch operations once we're in the airlock, so both opening the hatch and closing it when we're at the very end. So they'll get the SAFER device on his spacesuit and then move over to get the SAFER device onto Josh Cassada's. And after that, we'll be ready to start stepping into the actual depressurization phase of our spacewalk. So they'll move both crew members who have all of the tools that they're going to need, and we'll go over those tools as they're using them throughout the spacewalk today. And they also have on the front of the spacesuits essentially a mini workstation with a lot of those tools, tethers, other things that they'll need. They'll also have a small bag that they're going to bring out that has the cables that we're going to be using to integrate that newly installed solar array into the 4A power channel along with the existing one. So we're going to see them bring all of that into the airlock, and then Koichi and Nicole will work to get the hatch closed between the two different sections of the Quest airlock. We have the equipment lock. That's where they are right now. That's where we store the spacesuits, all the different spacewalking gear when it's not in use. And then we have the crew lock section, and so that's where we're going to see Frank start moving to next, and that is what actually gets brought down to vacuum. You're also going to see their suits. You can see one going into the crew lock, kind of the large white hoses. Those are known as the SCMs, the service or SEU service and cooling umbilicals. So their spacesuits are essentially hardline to space station systems right now, giving them communications, power, fluids for cooling, all of that. And we don't unplug those until we're about to essentially start the EVA. The operations teams consider as they switch their suits to battery power. So after they're unplugged and on battery powered, that'll be the official start of our spacewalk. And that doesn't happen until we've brought that crew lock section all the way down to vacuum. And so we see Frank Rubio now over in the crew lock section, helped by Koichi Wakata. And next up, we're going to get Josh Cassada off of the mount there on the wall, get his SAFER attached, and then move him into the crew lock section to join with Frank.
Not yet.
All right, now we see Wakata bringing in the safer device that's going to get attached to Josh Cassada's suit. Now, we're going to see these two go out of the airlock, and then they're going to kind of go their separate ways at first before meeting back up for the install. So Josh Cassada is going to be getting into the APFR, the Articulating Portable Foot Restraint, on the space station's robotic arm, the Canadarm2. And back inside of the station, Nicole Mann's going to be what's called the M1. She's going to be the primary robotics controller, essentially, for this spacewalk, and she's going to be literally flying Cassada as he's at the tip of that arm to the different work sites. And so they'll Cassada and Rubio are going to meet back up over at the FSE, the flight support equipment. That's the temporary stow location right now for the last IROSA array that just arrived on a SpaceX Cargo Dragon. And they're going to work to release some of the beams that are in place to help keep it secure during launch and all of the movement operations. They'll remove those beams, and then they'll release the actual array itself from IROSA. And then after that, flying on the end of the robotic arm, Josh Cassada is going to get moved over to that work site, bringing the array with him. And then once they're there, they'll get into the actual installation steps, and that'll involve, as we saw through some of those graphics, actually unfolding the array into its configuration where it could be installed. First thing they'll do is essentially get it soft captured. It'll slide into place, and there's some soft capture mechanisms that put that initial hold on the array, and then there's a number of bolts that they'll drive to secure it in place. And then after that's done, they tension some of the mid joints to make sure that it stays unfolded, and then we actually step into deploying, or first we actually will mate the cables that are responsible for integrating that array into the 4A power channel along with the existing one. So that work has to be done in Eclipse as the primary inhibit. Really the way we make sure that the arrays aren't transmitting any power down to where those cable connections are made is to be in Eclipse, be on the dark side of planet Earth, where those arrays can't see the sun, can't generate any electricity, and so the spacewalk itself is timed per our timeline. If you've ever watched a spacewalk, you'll know that every single step essentially timelined out and practiced here on the ground in the pool and through previous spacewalks. But the entire all the activities today are timelined, so by the time we hit the expected point for essentially that cable connection, cable mating, will be in an eclipse. So we'll be on the dark side of Earth, those arrays not generating any electricity, and them able to actually mate, actually install those cables to start integrating that. And so after those cables get connected, they will deploy the IROSA. It'll unfurl all on its own. They just release 2 bolts, and then the array, its internal mechanisms do the rest of the work to actually unfurl. And then they'll do one final tensioning task to enable a device that's going to essentially pull on some wire that adds some tension to the arrays, and then it's on to clean up, stowing some of the final beams on the temporary spot where the arrays are stored, and then it'll be on to ingress, coming back inside the airlock. And we start a spacewalk when we switch to battery power. We end a spacewalk when they begin repressing that crew lock section of the Quest airlock. So those will be our start and stop points for today, but things progressing really smoothly so far. We've already got Frank Rubio in the crew lock section, and we can see the safer device getting affixed now. That's Nicole Mann on the right side of Josh Cassada's spacesuit, and as soon as that's there, they're going to start moving Cassada into that crew lock section, and then we'll get ready to move into the depress steps. And the teams down here in Mission Control Houston did their go, no go, and we are going to be go for depress once the crew is ready. So a lot more to come, and we're going to see Cassada now start to make his way over to that crew lock section. And now we see Koichi Wakata and Nicole Mann guiding Josh Cassada into that crew lock section of the Quest airlock. Safer attached, all the different equipment tethers from his backpack to his helmet, all engaged. And so they're going to put him in his suit, and then you can see his service and cooling umbilical, that white hose that's kind of looping outside of the left part. That'll get moved in as well. And then we'll start to hear the crew step through some of the actual depressurization of the airlock. And that's done using essentially two different means. We have an actual air pump that's able to extract the atmosphere and return it to essentially the station's supply of atmosphere. That's going to get engaged, and that's going to bring the pressure down to about 5 psi. And then once we get there, we're going to turn the pump off, and the crew is going to do leak checks. So they do a leak check on their spacesuit once they're at a lower pressure inside the crew airlock. So we'll hear the crew status their leak check. They'll give a yes, no on successful leak check. And then after that, we can continue with the depress. And then after that, we start to use the two different systems. So that depress pump can only work down to about 2 psi. After that, it's no longer really capable of extracting atmosphere from that crew lock section. And so after that, they open what's known as an MPEV valve to just take all of that remaining atmosphere, and it's used to vent it overboard. So we do lose a small amount of what we call consumables, just the breathable atmosphere, every time we do a spacewalk, just because your pump can't work below 2 psi. But it's once you're down at that low of a pressure, it's a pretty negligible amount. And so after that remaining pressure drops, all that remaining atmosphere is vented overboard. We get down to about half a psi or lower, and then the crew will get the go to actually open up the hatch. And Frank Rubio's EV1, he's going to be the one opening up, doing the external hatch operations for today. So we'll hear that. So we're going to hear the suit IV on board. So in this case, likely Koichi Wakata, we're going to hear him talking to the crew as they step through the depress up until we get to that up until we get that pressure all the way down, and then it's going to hand over to the ground IV for today, and that's going to be NASA astronaut Nick Hague. He's the one we're going to hear talking to the crew members throughout all of the different procedures today, essentially being the voice for all the teams down here on the ground. And just a reminder, some of your key players here in the room today, you've got Nick Hague, who's going to be that suit IV, and then our flight director leading the teams is Fiona Turret. And then in the very back row, we've got Chris Mundy. He's the EVA flight controller leading all of the different flight control teams responsible for building, training, executing today's spacewalk. We always talk about how everybody in this room is essentially just the tip of the spear, the tip of the iceberg. We've got a couple of other key folks on the EVA team that are going to be working with Chris today. Some of those primary positions, we have an EVA task officer. This is somebody who understands every procedure in this EVA front to back and essentially all by heart at this point. And for today, that's going to be Miranda Nelson with the task support position coming from Lucas Widener. And then we'll have two essentially technical specialists on the EVA team. Today it's Michael Dino. He's the EMU, the extravehicular mobility unit specialist, essentially knowledgeable in all things spacesuit for today. And then Stephen Villano is going to be our airlock specialist, responsible for overseeing all the different systems in the airlock, which we're still in right now. So that team working together to help the flight control team get ready and to go out and execute this spacewalk today. All right, and right now we can see Koichi. So he was just talking. They have a hardline connection right now between the crew in the equipment lock and the crew, both Cassada and Rubio in their spacesuits. And then once we get to the actual depress, though, we'll start to hear a lot more chatter. You'll hear Koichi essentially giving them instructions to, as they're switching a depress pump on, that located on the UIA, the umbilical interface assembly. That's a large control panel unit that's inside, and that's connected to those service and cooling umbilicals. That's the main interface between the spacesuits and the airlock itself. Before we get there, they're making sure they have all of their tools. We don't have any extra hardware in the crew lock itself, as again, that's about to be exposed to vacuum. So they do just a final sweep of that, and then we'll see the hatch get closed.
Station Houston on space to ground 1 for airlock.
Head on 1.
I just wanted to give you a heads up. The ground is putting step 80 in place, so the crew will be hot mic'd in the seat.
Okay, crew's going hot, Mike.
And that was Capcom Megan Levins talking to Nicole Mann on board the station, giving them a heads up. So the crew inside the suits, Josh Cassada, Frank Rubio, they're going to be hot mics, so won't have any push to talk required. They're just going to be able to talk in real time throughout this spacewalk today. And we see Koichi Wakata working to get the hatch closed, isolating the crew lock section.
Houston, good morning. EV2, TCV now at 5.
Copy 5.
So now lock, we're in step 77, and step 76 and 77 are complete.
Copy complete.
And you guys can take care of steps 78 through 80.
Copy, it's in work.
And so with those call downs, Koichi Okada letting the team here in Houston know that the hatch has been closed. The emergency MPEF, so the manual pressure equalization valve, is closed. That gets closed before we step into the actual depress activities. Again, we're going to be initially using that pump to essentially pump the atmosphere out of out of the crew lock section of the Quest airlock. We're going to bring it down to 5 psi and then pause to allow the crew to do a quick leak check on their suits, and then we'll resume, and then we'll get that depress pump, bringing it down to about 2 psi, and then we start to also use what's known as the emergency MPEV, manual pressure equalization valve. And what that's essentially doing is taking the remaining atmosphere out of the crew lock section and dumping it out into the vacuum of space as that pump stops to work once we get down to 2 psi. So all that's coming up. Meanwhile, the teams here on the ground are just doing some final configuration work. We heard the crew go hot mic, so they're going to be talking without any push-to-talk, without push-to-talk being necessary throughout their space flight, or their spacewalk, and we're going to be hearing them talk directly to the ground IV here in Houston, and that's going to be NASA astronaut Nick Hague.
Station Houston on Space to Ground 1 for airlocks. Steps 78 through 80 are complete.
Okay, copy that. Thank you. And both AV crew members, your hot mic to on Space Ground 1 at this time.
Okay, thank you, Roger. AV2 copies, thanks.
Okay, Josh, on UIA, please check depress pump power is off.
Depress pump power OFF.
Thank you. And then please verify depress pump enabled LED on.
Depress pump power enable illuminated.
Copy. Houston, we are in step 84. With your go, we will proceed with the cue card.
And station, your go.
Thank you. Okay, Josh, we will start the depress cue card. Crew rock depress. On UIA, switch depress pump power to on and wait 10 seconds for complete startup.
Depress pump power on.
Okay, Josh, and depress pump manual ISO valve to open, and both of you guys expect alert tone.
Depress pump man ISO valve coming to open and copy on the alert. Everyone copy.
And then monitor suit P gauges less than 5.5.
Everyone copy. AV2 copies. Depress pump man ISO is open.
And with that, the depressurization of the crew lock section of the Quest airlock is in work. So we were just listening as Koichi Wakata was walking Josh Cassidy's EV2. He's working at the UIA, the umbilical interface assembly, essentially a control panel that they have inside of the crew lock section that allows them to access the depress pump. There's service and cooling umbilicals that are connected to their suits, providing power, hardline comm, and also fluids at this point. So still integrated into the station systems. We did get confirmation that the pressure is now dropping inside of the crew lock. So we're going to continue to just draw that atmosphere out using the depress pump until the crew lock gets to right about 5 psi, at which point the crew lock is going to get the direction to shut that pump down. They're going to close that isolation valve. And then at that point, they're then going to step into leak checks. So doing quick automated leak checks using the display and control module on their spacesuits of their EMUs. Because again, while we still have pressure inside, the EMUs are going to be at a slightly higher pressure than that 5 psi, and they're going to do a leak check and make sure we don't have any atmosphere or anything like that coming out of the suit. After we get past leak checks, we'll step back into that depress activity. They're going to open that isolation valve again. That's going to allow the depress pump to continue working. They're also going to open what's called an emergency MPEV, manual pressure equalization valve. We start using that after we're below 5 psi, essentially working in conjunction with the pump itself, and that's going to continue until the crew lock hits about 2 psi. At that point, the pump, its valve is going to get closed and it's going to get powered off as the pump stops working once we get to 2 psi and below. The emergency MPEV remains opened as we will continue to watch the pressure drop. We'll get to a little less than half of a psi, usually a lot closer to 0, at which point we're essentially in vacuum. You'll have essentially an equal pressure between the crew lock and the outside of the space station, which is at vacuum.
In step 85, the removed metal canisters are serial number 20 and 22.
Easy copy, good numbers.
And that call down right there was reporting the removal of some of the canisters that are used to remove CO2 while everybody's inside of the equipment lock section. So at this point, all of that CO2 removal being done by the normal station systems like the CDR, the carbon dioxide removal assembly. We talked a little bit earlier about the MEDOX canisters inside the spacesuits. That's how we're essentially capturing that carbon dioxide that they're breathing out throughout their spacewalk. Those are regenerative, so they have essentially a saturation point at which point they won't be able to remove any more CO2 as they're using a chemical process, using an oxide inside. Once all that oxide is used up, we're not removing any more CO2. So that's why we're keeping an eye on that and some of the other consumables throughout the spacewalk, just to determine how long we're going to be out the door. After spacewalks, though, those MEDOX canisters get removed and then they get put into a regenerative system. It's essentially an oven where we heat those canisters up. That breaks the bonds between that oxide and the carbon dioxide. That oxide can then be used again. That carbon dioxide gets dumped into the larger station atmosphere and then gets removed using the ECLSS, the life support system on board station. So that's how we're kind of constantly reusing and recycling these MEDOX canisters used in these spacesuits for spacewalks. Keeping an eye, though, the crew lock section's still a little over 8.5 psi. We're counting down from about 14.7, which is what the station atmosphere is kept at. It's pretty close to what you have here at sea level. It's 14.7 psi. We're going to see the pressure continue to tick down in the crew lock section until we're at about 5, at which point Josh Cassada is going to essentially close the valve, turn that pump off, stop it from working so they can conduct those leak checks. And then after we're past the leak checks, we can start to get into the final depress and then the beginning of our spacewalk. Reminder, for the U.S. spacewalks, operationally we mark the beginning of a spacewalk is when the crew switches over to battery power, so it's after they're off those umbilicals and running solely on batteries inside the suits. At that point we will already be in a vacuum setting inside the airlock, and then we're going to continue the timer until they're back in the airlock at the very end. And once the hatch is closed and we start to get the repressurization of the airlock, that'll mark the official end.
EV1 and 2, when the crew lock gets to 6.0 psi, expect alert tone.
EV1 copies. EV2 copies, thanks.
And the crew lock right now coming up on 7 psi. The crew's going to get an alert tone at 6. And then once we get to 5, they're going to close the isolation valve on that depressurization pump. It's going to stop it from drawing the atmosphere out, and then we'll step into those leak checks. You're going to hear them referred to as EV1, EV2. Just a reminder, EV1 for today is Frank Rubio. He's your lead spacewalker. He's going to be primed for all of the hatch operations when we're getting ready to exit the Quest airlock and when we're coming back at the end. And then EV2 is Josh Cassada. This is the third spacewalk for this pair. They've already completed 2, each in excess of 7 hours. This one also planned to last about 7 hours. It's going to look very similar to the spacewalk that they just did back on December 3rd, where they installed one of these IROSA solar arrays. At this point, we're just going to a different power channel. So we're continuing to follow along. We're at about 6.5 psi inside the crew lock. So again, that next major checkpoint is going to be once we hit 5. And meanwhile, in the equipment lock section, we're continuing to see Nicole Mann on the left, Koichi Wakata there in the middle. He's got in his hand what's known as the depress repress cue card. That's where he's reading off the procedures to get the instructions to the crew. And we're below 6 psi now, so we're going to be coming up soon on that 5 psi hold point. They're going to continue to put the crew lock, or the equipment lock section, kind of back in order a little bit, and then they're going to move over to set up for the robotic operations for today. So they're going to be responsible for operating the Canadarm2, the big robotic arm, as they're going to be using that to...
Houston EV2, TCV's back to 4 again.
Again, they're going to be using that robotic arm. Josh Cassada is going to be...
Okay.
Houston copies, TCV4.
Thank you. Houston EV1, not sure if I ever told you my TCV, I moved it to 6. It was before we transitioned to hot mic.
Copy 6.
And those values that you're hearing, their TCV, that's their temperature control valve. That's just a small dial that they have on the front of their spacesuits and that display and control module. And they use that to essentially actively control just how cool or how cold the cooling is inside their suits.
Depress pump manual ISO valve closed.
Depress pump man ISO valve.
And both of you expect alert tone.
Everyone copy? And copy. Baton creature, we are enclosed.
Just confirm depress pump manual ISO valve is closed.
Depress pump man ISO valve is closed.
Thank you. EV1 and 2, we do the leak check. So switch display status until leak check question mark displayed.
copy. Check question mark for EV2. EV1.
And then switch display yes, hold for 2 seconds, and follow displayed instructions.
EV1 copy. EV2 copies.
All right, so right now we're holding at 5 psi inside of that crew lock section where Frank Rubio and Josh Cassada are suited up. They're now stepping through leak checks on their spacesuits.
EV1, leak check complete. Leak check complete for EV2.
The check O2 actuator in EVA.
EV1 on work. In work for EV2.
And getting word, we've had 2 good leak checks, so both suits checked out, looking good for today. Next up, we're going to be able to step back in to start continuing with the depressurization of the crew lock area. So at this point, we're going to hear them essentially turn that depress pump back on, opening up that isolation valve. And then also opening up what's called the emergency MPEV. That's a manual pressure equalization valve. And those two are going to work in concert to continue dropping the pressure down. That depress pump's going to continue working until we're at about 2 psi inside the airlock. Then that's going to get turned off. And then the rest of the atmosphere will go out via that emergency MPEV, that manual valve.
EVA. And O2 position EVA for EV2.
Copy that, thank you. For Josh, depress pump manual ISO valve to open, and both of you expect alert tone.
EV1 copy. EV2 copies. Depress pump man ISO valve coming to open.
Copy. Okay, Josh, depress pump manual ISO valve is already open, right?
Depress pump man ISO valve is open.
Thank you. EV1 and 2, monitor suit P gauge less than 5.5.
EV1 copy. EV2 copies.
And so by opening up that isolation valve, the depress is once again in work. So the depress pump, we're already at about 4.25 psi, so it's going to continue ticking down again until we get to about 2, and then all the work gets done by that manual pressure equalization valve to get the rest of the atmosphere that's going to get vented out. The pump saves all the atmosphere. The valve rejects it out into the vacuum of space, so we do lose a small amount of atmosphere with every single spacewalk, but it's largely a negligible amount And we have the capability to continually essentially put breathing gases back into the station's atmosphere through cargo flights, but the majority of it just constantly being recycled by the different hardware on board. And just checking in, we're continuing with the depress of the crew lock section of the Quest airlock. We're down just above 2. So again, after we get to 2, the pump's going to come off, and then it's over to a manual valve to vent out the rest.
Crew lock is at 2 psi. Depress pump manual ISO valve closed.
Depress pump man ISO valve is closed.
Okay, on UIA, switch depress pump power to off, OFF.
Depress pump power off, OFF.
Okay, thank you. And now we'll hand over to Nick for the follow-on depress Q card procedures. We'll talk with you from the robotics workstation.
Thanks, Luigi. Amazing job, 2 days in a row.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks, Guichi, Duke, for getting them all suited up and ready to go. And good morning / afternoon, Josh, Frank. Let's start by going through your tether config.
Hey, Nick, good morning. And thank you to the entire team for getting us here. Good job, and looking forward to working with you two. All right, so I will start. That's my waist tether. There you go. Okay, so my red hook is on my right D-ring extender, gate closed, hook lock back on back. My red reel is unlocked, My yellow hook is over to my green reel, gate closed, hook lock, black on black. Green hook is to my red reel, gate closed. It is unlocked. And then my anchor hook is on my mini workstation. My right waist tether is on my right D-ring extender, gate closed, hook lock, black on black. And that goes over to Josh's anchor hook, and I can see both hooks are gate closed, hook lock, black on black. Josh, I'll go over to you.
Okay. Starting with my left side, my left waist tether is gate closed, fighter lock, black on my D-ring extender. It goes to the D-ring extender of the airlock. And that hook is gate closed, fighter lock, black on black. Also on that left D-ring extender of mine, I've got a safety tether hook, gate closed, fighter lock, black on black. That is my 55-foot that is unlocked and goes to my mini workstation. On my right side, I've got my safety tether pack, my red hook, gate closed, fighter lock, black on my D-ring extender. Red reel is unlocked. On that red reel is a green hook. It is unlocked. The yellow hook goes to my green reel. It is gate closed, fighter lock, black on black. That green hook, or that green reel is unlocked. And as Frank pointed out, my anchor for that safety tether pack is gate closed, fighter lock, black on black onto his waist tether, gate closed, fighter lock, black on black. And finally, my right waist tether is gate closed, slider lock, black on my right D-ring extender, and it goes to my mini workstation.
And Frank, Josh, we copy all that is a good tether config.
Yeah, thanks, Nick.
All right, so quick status. We just heard the ground IV, that's NASA astronaut Nick Hague. He's going to be talking our two crew members through the spacewalk today, so he's the voice you'll be hearing from here in Mission Control. Meanwhile, Frank Rubio, EV1, Josh Cassada, EV2 in the crew lock. They're getting closer to vacuum. There's just about 1 pound per square inch of pressure still inside. It's going to continue to leak down. Once they get to about half of a PSI, they'll get the go to open up the hatch and begin this spacewalk today. Again, the operational start time for today is after they get off of those service and cooling umbilicals and switch their suits over to battery power.
Just checking in with you as we wait for the crew lock to get down to 0. One reminder, when it gets close, you can expect some alert tones. Big picture, in terms of timeline, Koichi and Duke did an awesome job. You guys were super efficient, and we're 10, 15 minutes up on the timeline. So we're just going to go nice and slow and methodical out the hatch, and let the MEDOX condition properly. And then also, we're going to have a patch of some RADICOM. We're going to be down KU. We should have S-band, so we'll try to maintain voice through that. So we may ask you to repeat some things if we don't hear them. Just want to give you a heads up.
Okay, we copy. Nick, and thanks so much for the overview.
E2 copies as well, Nick, and just a heads up, I went TCV to 5.5 just in case we find ourselves in a warm restart.
Copy, Josh. 5.5 on the TCV, and I've got the cuff checklist open.
All right, so the crew continuing to wait until we get that crew lock just about down to vacuum. We're less than a PSI. You just heard another reference to TCV. That's the thermal control valve. Anytime the crew's altering that, they're just giving a heads up to the team on the ground. It's a small dial that they have on the front of their suits.
So what we're going to look for is crew lock pressure less than a half PSI, and that can be from our telemetry down here, or if you see it on the DCM or the hatch gauge.
Copy it.
And so probably looking at a couple more minutes until we get just below half a PSI, and they'll be able to step through the hatch operations. But you'll hear those TCV values standing for a thermal control valve. It's a small dial that goes between 0 and 10 on the front of their suits, and then the higher the number, the colder that they're making it. As the astronauts are working inside of the suit, again, you're in a completely sealed environment. You're essentially in a small spacecraft yourself. You're generating heat, and so we have an active heat rejection system to help keep them cool. They wear what's known as a liquid cooling and ventilation garment, or LCVG, that looks a little similar to long underwear, and then it has tubing throughout the entire thing that's able to run cold water around them. And so as they generate heat, that heat transfers into that liquid running around them, that then goes into the backpack section of the spacesuit, and ultimately gets to a place called the sublimator. And that's going to be using a physical process known as sublimation. So some of that water eventually turning into ice as it's exposed to vacuum, and then that ice sublimates. And by sublimating, we're going directly from a solid to a gas. That's what sublimation means. And so that ice turns into a vapor essentially as it's exposed to vacuum, and the act of sublimating draws energy from stuff around it. That's drawing that heat away from the water that's passing through the sublimator, and then it's cooled down and then goes right back through that liquid cooling garment. So that's essentially the process that we're using to help keep the crew members cool while they're working inside of the spacesuit. And they can control that freely throughout their spacewalk. They either start getting into a more intensive activity or spending a lot of time in direct sunlight, that can tend to heat up the suits, so they can actively turn up and turn down the cooling just however they need to throughout. And right now we're at about 0.6 psi, so a little bit further to go, at which point they'll get the go. So Frank Rubio, he's EV1 today. Once they're outside, you'll be able to recognize him by having the red stripes around the legs of his suit. And then Josh Cassada is EV2. This is going to be the third spacewalk that this pair has done together. Pretty much all of these have been focused on this work to continue upgrading the power generation system on the station. Just a couple of quick stats as we get ready. This is going to be the 257th spacewalk in support of station assembly, and the 12th one out of the spacewalk this year. So again, the third one for them.
Sublimator pressure, airlock pressure of 0.4.
Frank, as a heads up, I've got a blank screen, but I have not navigated.
Okay. Mine went, once we hit 0.5, mine also went blank, but I can static down to supplemental P.
And Frank, copy your reading on the gauge. We see a little bit higher pressure here. We're going to wait just a little bit, 10 seconds to a handover. I'll catch you on the other side.
P1 copy.
And so you just heard we're heading into a handover. So we're heading into a period where pretty much over the next 20 minutes we might have our video connection with the station kind of cutting in and out as we move through gaps in coverage between our teasers, our tracking data, and relay satellites. The good thing about spacewalks is we'll pretty much have wall-to-wall connection with the station in terms of video coverage once we're out the door. But for the next 20 minutes, it'll be a little bit ratty, so we might be comms only. But quick status, both Frank Rubio, Josh Cassada in the crew lock section of the airlock. They had 2 successful leak checks on their suits as we went through the depress. They have been moving about 10-15 minutes ahead of the timeline. Again, this is the 3rd one this pair has done with the help of Koichi Wakata and Nicole Mann to get suited up and get into the airlock itself. We're coming up on half of a PSI. Once we get a little bit below that, they'll get the go to start moving into some of the hatch operations and then getting their suits onto battery power, which will mark the official start of today's spacewalk. In total, planned to last about 7 hours today, with the goal of installing a new IROSA, an International Space Station rollout solar array that's going to further augment the station's power generation capability. So they already went through essentially a safety tether setup, as each of these crew members is going to be tethered to the station structure at all times throughout the spacewalk. So the first thing they do is just check the location of all those tethers before they head out the door.
Back with you. We see pressure less than 0.5 down here on the ground, so you're go to open and stow the EV hatch.
Copy. Go to open and stow. Good work.
And so Frank Rubio, EV1, just got the go to open and stow the EV hatch. That's the hatch that leads to the outside. That's going to give them open access out into the vacuum of space, after which they'll egress or exit the Station Quest airlock and begin the spacewalk today. So some of the first things they're going to do is split up. Josh Cassada moving off to get the space station's robotic arm ready.
Copy, Frank.
But Josh Cassada moving off to get the arm ready, but also start to prepare the IROSA for its removal from its temporary stow location, what's called the FSE. He's going to be releasing ARDS, anti-rotation devices. Those are just additional locks that are in place to help keep the IROSA secure on that temp site when they're backed into the trunk part of the Dragon spacecraft. Meanwhile, Frank Rubio is going to move out to the work site and begin routing some of the cables.
Emergency MPEV is closed.
Copy, Koichi.
And Koichi Wakata reporting emergency MPEV. That's the manual pressure equalization valve that we use to get rid of the last bits of atmosphere.
Just want to confirm you've got the hatch stowed as well.
Affirmative.
Okay, so we're going to step into post-depress. So both of you, you're going to want to stagger your switch throws. Expect warning tones, but you're going to take power to bat.
Copy. Good work.
EV2 copies. I'll stand by, Frank.
Okay. My power
confirms EV2. E2 is in bat, and I had found the display quickly. I saw power restart with the bite.
Okay, copy. And Frank, if you want to display Switch Pro to verify functionality as well.
To be clear, Nick, I have not done that yet. Understand we have a go for Pro.
Affirm. You both are go.
Nick, I have a good display.
And good display for EV2 as well. Great news.
All right. So, Josh, you want to take power for EV1 and 2 to OFF and verify that all the 4 LEDs go out.
Copy that. IA power EV1. OFF. Power EV2. OFF. All 4 LEDs are out.
Okay. You're both go to disconnect your
I think this
SPUs.
is expected.
Okay, one copy.
I'm going to throw this message. I think this is expected. Suit P high.
Hey, Josh, we didn't hear the message. If you could repeat.
SCU. Yeah, I had a suit P high, and I throwed it. Assume that was expected.
And Josh, that is expected.
Broken. I'm holding SCU for now.
Is your suit P gauge good?
Yeah, I'm showing 4.6. I think we just need to breathe it down.
Yep.
And Frank, Josh, we've got RADICOM right now. I want to let you know that that message was expected for Suit P high.
Copy. We agree. I'm showing coming down to 4.5 now and demating the SCU.
Copy. And you're both go to demate the SCUs, install the DCM cover, and then stow the SCU in its pouch.
One copy.
EV2 covers.
And so a lot of developments there real quick. So our spacewalk did officially start. Both of these crew members, Frank Rubio and Josh Cassada, switching their suits over to battery power at 7:19 a.m. Central Time. That's it.
Josh, your SCU stow is complete.
And EV1 IP is disconnected and stowed, and DCM covers on.
Copy, Frank. So, Josh, if you can check that the depressed pump man ISO valve is closed.
Depressed pump man ISO valve is closed.
So for both of you, you'll take your TCV to max hot.
I'll do max hot in work.
V2 is in max hot.
And copy, Josh.
And again, the official start time of our spacewalk today, 7:19 a.m. Central Time, 8:19 a.m. Eastern.
EV1 max hot.
Copy, Frank. And so you're both go to take your water switch to on.
Copy. EV1 water is on.
EV2 water is on.
And you'll check your DCM is blank and your bite is off.
Affirmative for EV1. right blank and bite off for EV2.
Copy for both, and you're good to set your TCV as desired, and I'm 5 seconds from a handover.
EV1 copy.
And so a quick handover until we get comm back, but again, a lot has just unfolded. Our spacewalk officially started, 7:19 a.m. Central, 8:19 a.m. Eastern. Both the crew members in a fully depressurized airlock with the hatch open switched their suits over to battery power, kicking things off. After that, they had disconnected and stowed the SCU, the service and cooling umbilical, that up until that point was able to provide both power, cooling, fluids, and hardline communications. Those get stowed with the special cover over them until the very end of our spacewalk when they get attached back to their suits.
Welcome back. I am set at 5. Actually, 5.5.
EV2 TCV 4.
Copy, 5.5 and 4. We'll take a suit P gauge reading from both of you.
EV1 4.3.
EV2 4.3.
Okay, copy. And just to let you know, we're good suit parameters here on the ground. Your visors, you're going to be going out into daylight. And we are ready, Frank, for you to open the thermal cover.
Okay, copy that. And work.
And Frank, as you do that, you'll stow the hook on the stiffener tether point, cinch the strap, and then report the number of Sharpie lines.
Copy.
All right, so again, the crew underway with our spacewalk. The clock started ticking about 7.5 minutes ago at 7:19 a.m. Central Time. They've reconfigured a couple of different systems in the crew lock section, the service and cooling umbilicals. They double-checked that the...
Go to the tether point, and I see 6 Sharpie lines.
Copy, Frank, 6 lines, and you're go to egress the airlock. And just for your guys' essay, we're still voice only for the next handful of minutes.
EV1 copies.
EV2 copies.
All right, Josh, you ready?
Ready.
Hey, go.
All right, so Rubio and Cassada starting to move out of the airlock.
You're looking to put your anchor down on the port stanchion of handrail 554.
Rubio will be first out as EV1. He's opening up a thermal cover. It's a small bit of protective covering that sits on the outside of the hatchway. They're going to be able to close that once they get outside. It just protects the interior of the airlock from different thermal concerns from direct sunlight. First thing out is, again, double-checking some tether points, getting those ready, and then we're going to see these two spacewalkers split off to go do different tasks.
On the port stanchion of 0554, Cape Coral Hook Lock, flight on by.
Copy, Frank. That's a good config. So you're go to put Josh's anchor on the aft D-ring.
Copy.
And so the first tethers they're working with are the anchor ones. These are one of several that they're going to use to remain tethered to the station structure at all times. Frank's got one to a handrail right outside, and as he's first out, he'll be able to attach Josh's anchor, which is currently attached to one of his own waist tethers, to a different ring just outside of the airlock.
All right, Josh, you are on the D-ring, gate closed, hook lock, black on black. Copy. And just verify something real quick. Okay, we're both on good config. Your anchor hook still says ED1 pack. I just wanted to verify it was all correct. Okay. And I see my tether pack to be 0554, and your tether pack is going back inside. Again, gate closed, hook lock, black on black to the aft ring.
Hey, copy all, Frank.
Go. Go ahead.
Yep, no, Frank, we concur. Good path. Your go to release, Josh, you can release your waist tether.
Copy. Go to pick up my waist tether from the D-ring extender.
All right, so getting those initial tether points in place as both move to get out of the airlocks. We should be getting video comm back with the station in about 4 minutes.
I am tethered to the mic bag, and we have a go to release. And I will bring the part small with me.
Okay, Nick, so Nick has got his BRT right on the M bag. He's also got it on his BRT. And I'm going to go ahead and release the big hook from inside, and we'll take that with us, if you agree.
Those are good words, Josh.
All right, Frank, here comes the hook.
Okay. We're going to release.
And right now, Josh Cassada working to retrieve and hand over a crew lock bag that has the power cables that we're going to be using.
Copy.
You are clear. It sounds at a really bad angle when you come out, so it'll be right in your face. You ready for it?
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
And Frank Rubio is going to take that bag.
You guys are in a good config. Frank, you're going to position to the forward side of the airlock for Josh's egress.
Okay, I am there.
So again, stepping through this initial egress, exiting of the airlock activity. Frank Rubio already outside the airlock, getting ready to give the go for Josh to move outside as well. Now, once they get outside and we're able to get this video comm back in the next 2 to 3 minutes, they'll get the goes to turn on their HECA, which, if you love acronyms.
And Frank, Josh, once you guys are both outside, the first thing we'll have you do is turn on your HECA.
You want copies?
I think it looks like I'm getting hung up, but my PGT is clear. Can you see?
What? Your PGT is clear. I think.
There we go.
Yep, just.
Might have just been
There you go. Yeah, I think it was your foot just slightly set.
Okay.
Okay, and next ED1 goes on.
Copy, Frank.
Again, once we get video back, they'll be turning the HECAs on. We heard that call, or that go from Nick Hague down here on the ground. Now, HECA, that's H-E-C-A. That's an acronym with acronyms inside of acronyms. That HECA stands for the High Definition.
Once you're in a good position, let me know. We'll start buddy check.
Copy.
high definition extravehicular activity mobility unit camera assembly. So
Matt, or the thermal cover first, I guess, buddy check. I'm ready when you are. Okay. Oops, let me get my effect on. Okay. I kidding about that sun.
Yep, I don't see green LED.
Oh.
It is. It's it on.
Okay.
Okay. I'll go ahead and start with you. So, it's a good head to light, good. WZ has, although that's hard to tell, to be honest, because the sun is super bright in my eyes. Coming down, let's see, 1, 2, 3 caps. Up. And a little bit to your left, please. Two safety handles are down. And your tools and cutters look like they are in a good config.
Okay, copy that. Got your WVS. And if you move your left hand just slightly. Oh man, I don't see your HECA. Is that on? Can you see it in your mirror? Actually, I don't.
Yep, it's on.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yep, I've got both. Okay. And I've got 3 tabs up. And let's see, your safer handles. These visors back up. And then rotate to your left so I can see. There you go, I got both. Both safer handles are down. And finally, your tool config. The bag is hanging down at your knee, but I think that'll be fine.
Okay, thank you.
And your tether looks good.
Okay.
So I've got a dry hat. And I've got good buddy checks.
And I also have a dry hat. So if you're with us, we have good buddy checks for both ED1 and ED2.
Yeah, copy, Frank. Josh, we're back with you, and we're picking up KU now. We should have video here shortly. We copy good buddy checks. Just wanted to confirm that the reels were unlocked. We might have missed that before, and then after that, it'll be close the thermal cover.
Two unlocked.
ED1, 2 reels unlocked.
Copy. Thanks for double checking that for us. Your go to close the thermal cover.
Good. Sure. Okay, thermal cover is closed.
It doesn't look like it's staying. Okay. I think that that little D-ring is probably in the way. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a good check. You want to make sure that that D-ring strap's not over the magnet.
And that is now clear.
I agree. Looks good.
Thermal cover is closed.
Copy. So, Frank, you're going to translate out to the green hook location. You're leading the way. Just a reminder for no fare leading.
Okay, copy that. En route over to the starboard seat coast. Hi, Josh. A little bit.
Okay, I'll be there with you.
all right, well, with that, we heard Frank and Josh going through what's called buddy checks. As you can imagine, it's hard to get a good look at your own suit.
There, Josh, as you're following, just a reminder for the caution to watch out for the tug cable.
Everyone copy. Thank you.
Maybe 2 copies, thank you.
And so the buddy checks, each of these astronauts gets a look at the other, verifying that they see lights for things like their HECA, the helmet cams, and then the various.
George, I'm at the top of the feeder spur.
Okay. Good. I'm on the feeder spur.
Again, looking at things like the safer handles, making sure they're not engaged, things of that nature. And it looks like we're starting to get our first helmet camera view. So this is number 20, so this should be Frank Rubio, whose first task is going to be to head out to the actual site where we're going to be installing the iROSA today and start routing some of the cables. And so he's got, it's essentially two cables, but they're going to be functioning as two different Y connectors. So one end of the cables is split into two pieces. One end goes into the new iROSA once it's there, the other into a connection for the existing solar array, and then those get plugged in to the 4A power channel. And so by installing all these, once the iROSA is in place, we're essentially going to be integrating the iROSA and the existing array into the same power channel.
It's already up there.
Yep, copy. And so, Frank, you're going to be looking for handrail 3652. That should be just nadir of the starboard seat card.
Okay, 3652.
And then each of the handrails on the outside have numbers.
Your handrail is 3651 on the nadir stanchion.
Copy. 3651 nadir stanchion.
But each of those handrails will have numbers engraved into them, so that's what they can use to help kind of find their way. And this is just looking right over the shoulder of Frank Rubio as he starts to head out to the work site to start routing some of those cables. Meanwhile, Josh Cassada splitting off.
Houston, space to ground 3 for Koichi or Duke for robotics.
And for both of
Not the starboard seat card.
and copy, you're at the starboard seat card.
Hey, dude, just wanted to let you guys know before you head into your midday meal that Josh and Frank are about 10 minutes up on the timeline, so they may be given that call to start robotics ops a little early. You guys are go for steps 1 and 2 whenever you are ready before then. And we'll give all of our robotics calls Duke on space to ground 3.
Frank, Josh, while you guys are working on your green hooks there, I'm going to read off some warnings and cautions, if that's okay.
Okay, next, just for your awareness, my green hook is down on the inboard stanchion of 3652. I'm en route to the bag.
Copy, Frank.
EV2 is ready for those cautions.
And so there's a warning.
EV1 also ready.
There's a warning for the grapple shafts and the cervic coupling teeth that there are no touch. And then for the FSC, it's a reminder to translate slow, less than 4 inches per second. Wait for motion to dampen out before imparting loads. Don't translate simultaneously, and avoid contact with iROSA blankets and solar cells.
EV1 copies.
EV2 copies, thanks.
And the ground IV for today, Nick Hague reading out a couple of cautions. Anytime we do these spacewalks.
So you've got a good green hook down. You're going to work on bundling the cable bag and then translating outboard. And Josh, 3651, you might have to wait for Frank and maybe able to give him a hand getting that bundle together.
Yeah, I agree. I think I will have to wait. Yep.
And big picture for both of you, we're about 10 minutes up on the timing with our eclipse, so we're good just working this slow and methodical and conditioning the MEDOX the right way.
Sounds great.
Okay, thank you.
Station Houston on space.
EV2, TCV is now 5.5.
Copy, Josh, 5.5.
Josh Cassada with another TCV call out, again just adjusting the thermal control valve on his suit, just how cool he's making it, and the number goes between 0 and 10. The higher the number, the colder it is.
Space ground 3 today for our ground call, since 2 is going to the Russian segment.
Okay.
Josh?
Hi. I think I will have to wait to get to that 3651 if you agree. Doesn't look like we want to go that, having me go past you.
Okay.
I can certainly help here if you need it.
Okay, great. Give me just 1 second to get this.
Okay. If you want me to, I can connect this large small that's off of the M bag to the keel bag, but I don't want to mess you up.
Tight together?
I think so you want it retracting, correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
Well,
Don't.
let her retract away and then lock it so it doesn't come out any further.
Oh,
Does that make sense?
yeah. But I think if you pull on it when it's locked out like that, it'll continue to let some out, not reel back in.
Okay.
You might not want to do that. That's up to you. If you want it is connected, you let me know if you want it locked out.
Thank you. Yeah, you can just leave it unlocked.
So you are large, small from the